Welcome to It's No Secret, a podcast for Kiwis who want their money questions answered.
Ready, steady, go.
This podcast will answer the money questions you may or may not have on your mind. We'll talk to real Kiwis and share truths about our own financial lives.
Both the successes and the failures. Because the truth is, there is no secret to achieving financial freedom. Hello and welcome to It's No Secret. I'm Kat.
And I'm Christine.
And today we will be chatting about a spicy opinion of why your home is for living in and not for growing wealth. Dun, dun, dun. So where has this come from? This statement was one that came from an Instagram post that I recently shared on my personal account, and we will absolutely be sharing it on the It's No Secret account. But it came from a financial journalist in Australia who had penned a quarterly opinion piece that is in a lot more detail, and we'll go into some information around, where he basically said that Australian housing wealth is meaningless, destructive, and fundamentally changing our society. And they are some pretty powerful statements to also share in a country, New Zealand, that really, really loves property in all its forms. Naturally, I had quite a few people slide into my DMs. One that I haven't spoken to in a while who just came in hot with love that you shared this, greatly disagree. And I was like, I am more than happy to talk to you about this. Tell me more.
I will engage in an argument if I need to.
Literally, but it was a respectful conversation. But the thing that really interests me is there are a couple of camps of people that I think this really incites conversation with, and we will get into, I guess, what the conversation is and what it means financially. But I have noticed that you get the most passionate responses from people that either are really, really into property, specifically investment property in New Zealand, and have generated a reasonable amount of wealth or done well out of that. And so they feel really like, I want to talk to you about this. But then also it incites quite a passionate response from people in the other end of the spectrum that are like, yes, your house is your home and should be your home and isn't for growing wealth and securing your financial security, and you need to do other things. And I just want to start this podcast by saying neither is wrong and neither is right. There is a place for both. This is not coming in hot with a
you must do this.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
It's just, let's talk about what this actually means. And I think that this is a really interesting point of view around, well, from a societal point of view, from a well-being point of view as a society, what does it mean for wealth or property and housing to be destructive and changing our society in a negative way? But then equally, because this is a financial podcast, is, property and housing the be all and end all when it comes to growing your wealth? And that's something that we've talked about before, but that's the angle I'd like to take. So before we jump into a few things, Christine, I'm going to hit you with a few facts from the article.
Love it.
The median house price in Sydney, now this is important because this is the median, not the average, is currently $1.1 million. Yep. It is reasonably similar in Melbourne, but slightly less. And the median in Sydney is actually more than double that in Perth and that of regional Australian areas. So the article that was penned by Alan Kohler, who's a financial journalist, I believe now in his 70s, really well respected financial journalist in Australia, he wrote this article. His kind of point was, this is primarily centered around, some of those bigger city areas. And he really was pitching the idea that high-priced homes do not create wealth, they redistribute it, and that financial success now in this day and age is largely a function of geography, i.e. where you end up living or where you have been lucky to end up living based on the choices of your family, as opposed to accomplishment. Any initial thoughts before I jump into this little story?
I completely agree.
You're like, tell me more. Okay.
I have reflected on it, and I think you'll get into the numbers, which kind of skew my view, but I just tend to completely agree that it isn't the rate at which our income has grown relative to the annual growth rate of house prices and the inability to keep up with that, and I know my sister would counter and say, yeah, but you just work hard and you save your money and then you buy blah, blah, blah. But I think it's also, we need to think about the place that people are coming from the beginning as well.
Yes.
I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit.
No. I think this perfectly lands us in that direction, because I think that's kind of the core of his argument and the statement around saying that, like, financial success, he says, particularly since the year 2000 was where the, societal shift started to change in Australia. Financial success from 2000 until now, so let's say roughly the last 24 years, 2 decades, has been based on the fact that people have owned homes and primarily owned homes in really good areas. Now, that has not been out of accomplishment, i.e. their financial success has been because they've had 20 years of 6% per annum compound annual growth rates, as opposed to, let's say, the person that 20 years ago didn't own a home and was just putting all of their money into other wealth creation, to your sister's point, working really hard. The sad reality for that person, though, is that the average annual growth rate in incomes has only been 3%. So if you look at those two things independently, well, of course, it's then skewing the success or measure of success to the person that's owned the property, because the rate of growth in that asset class has just been high.
Yeah, double.
Yeah, more than double. So we will link to the full article because I think it's really interesting to read. But basically what he goes on to explain is that, if he goes back to the time that his parents bought property in the 1950s, the average salary at that point in time was £341. The average cost of property or land cost about £1,000. So the salary to home price ratio, or income to price ratio, was around 3 to 3.5 times more. He also comments that from a societal factor, in the 1950s, it wasn't common that you needed to have 2 incomes to pay that mortgage. So typically there would be it would be a 1-income household, and you could comfortably afford to buy a property on that income. He then goes on to explain that in the 1980s, when he bought his home with his wife, the average salary in Australia was $11,500. Average property cost, land cost, about 40,000 Australian dollars. So still around that 3.5 times more. So a little bit higher than it was in the 1950s, but still 3.5 times more. He does go on to comment that, again, societal change tended to be that both adults were working, but it was not a necessity for both adults to be working. That was more around the fact that women wanted to have careers, it wasn't a necessity for them both to be working in order to afford buying a property. Now, fast forward to the 2020s, and he talks about this as an example as someone that has 3 children and has since watched his 3 children go through the home ownership process.
Yeah.
Exactly. And in Australia, the average salary is sitting at around $100,000. Average property land cost is $732,000. So the increase in required income ratio has gone from 3.5 times salary to 7.4 times annual income. And he goes on to note that in order to achieve this, it's pretty much a requirement these days for both people in a relationship to be working and contributing to the cost of that property ownership. Otherwise, it's not really possible. As we talked about just before, compound annual growth rate of house prices has been about 6% per annum. Hot tip, that's actually less than the long-term average of share markets, but that's a story for another day. And that comparative to the annual growth rate of average incomes of 3% is what has caused some of this skew. The TLDR of that I found really interesting was this has meant that within Australia, household debt has had to increase from half of an average disposable income to twice of an average disposable income, right? So back in the 1980s, your household debt would be half your average disposable income. Now you need twice your average disposable income in order to basically, afford that. And from a GDP point of view, across the whole country or the economy, it's gone from 40% of GDP to 120% of GDP, right? And he goes on to say that this is actually one of the most important facts about the Australian economy to date, because the large amount of housing debt that Australians carry mean that interest rates have a much greater impact on our lives, which in turn affects inflation, wages, employment, and economic growth. And I think for me, when I was reading it, that is where he's talking about the fact that it can become I guess, destructive and fundamentally changing our society, right? Because if we as a society so strongly value homes as a way to not only provide security but grow our wealth, but this requires so much more of our incomes and therefore we take on so much more debt as a society in order to sustain that, we are then at more risk to being impacted in our livelihoods on changing interest rates or other factors which are outside of our control. That in turn means, we have less money to spend on holidays, or we put more pressure on our employers to pay us more, or we do, various other things. And he kind of makes this comment about the fact that like in Australia, the real things that they've got going for them are land and resources, right? Yeah. And he's like, they have that in much more spread than, many other
New Zealand is
yes, exactly. Countries in the world. Yes. So, it's not a factor of the fact that, it's a small country and therefore this has contributed to the pressure. It's more the fact that it's a societal change in terms of what we value and how we have prioritized the need for growing wealth within our homes.
And to be clear, it's the house that you owner-occupied house, not an investment property.
Correct. Yeah. And I think that's where some of the people sliding into my DMs are a bit like, oh, no, investment properties still have a place and stuff. And I'm like, yes, they do. But that's not the majority, right? I think we can all acknowledge that the majority of New Zealanders do not own investment properties. Yeah. And even those that are investment property owners, your average mum and dad, I think it's less than, 2 houses each, basically. It's their primary home and then it's one. It's not, we're not talking about the small percentage of people that have successfully built property portfolios and that's their primary thing. That's a whole different kettle of fish. It's the people that have needed to put all of their money into their home in order to secure a certain type of living standard, and then by doing so almost ties you into just holding on to the fact that that is the home that's going to create you wealth, because you've already thrown so many eggs in that basket and you kind of just have to continue on doing that. And one thing that we've talked a bit about on the show before is you can't sell your bathroom to fund your retirement. And so, we talk about it sometimes in the point of view of, well, what happens at the end of, not end of life, but at the end of the cycle? What happens when you need to get money out of that? But the point that Alan Kohler is also making is, well, what happens over the course of, you're in your, not even 30 yet, Christine, what happens over the course for you of the next 30 years? Because although this could mean that you have a lot of wealth, it's not wealth that you can use. No. The only thing he points out that you can use it for is to buy a bigger home. Or to downsize.
To sell it, and then rent, or
you can't buy a boat. You can't go on holiday. There are a few small arguments, and this is where I think also sometimes people get in their head in the New Zealand context of being like, well, you could take equity out to then buy another investment property. So sure, there are a few things where maybe you could use that wealth to then buy another asset, but you're then predominantly buying another property asset, thereby fueling the problem even more. Right?
Yeah.
So thoughts, feelings.
I think about this in my context, being someone who doesn't own a home.
Yes.
It feels dire to be like, do you know what I mean? If this is the reality and the ratio is going to continue to go up from salary to home price, am I ever going to own a home? That's literally the question that is going through my head. And I know that I am in a privileged position, so the answer to that question is probably yes, but it's probably just going to be at a later point. Yes. But then that extends the time frame of which you then pay it off, and then it's like, well, then do I invest outside of that? That kind of stuff.
And I guess to the point that he's making is he's like, then at what cost, right? Because let's say that house prices the disparity between house prices and income in terms of their annual respective growth continues, right? Let's just assume that continues. Yep. There's no reason for us to think otherwise. And you do manage to get into a home, but it's like, at what cost? Are you then stuck into the cycle of also being forced into creating wealth within your home because you have to put so much of your own resources into getting on the property ladder in the first place that then it prohibits you from actually growing wealth in any other way. And so his point was he obviously feels that that's the way that we already have headed and that the only way that we can readjust as a society is by changing our overall societal view on what the purpose of property is for, and that the purpose of property is not actually to make you money and it's not to grow wealth if it's your home. It's a place to provide you shelter and comfort. And my sense is that there are some other countries around the world that obviously view property in a different way to perhaps we have in Australia and New Zealand, and he's kind of trying to challenge that notion. There's a super savage sentence that I am all about because I also fit into this category, and I think that it's really, really valuable to acknowledge is he says in the article that at the end of your life, your children get to use your housing wealth for their own housing, except that we're all living so much longer these days, so it's usually too late to be useful. And part of the part that he calls out around, I guess, the destructive nature of this for us as a society is that it is becoming increasingly more challenging for people to enter into the property market unless they have family members that have already done that. So if you're the person that is trying to be the first home owner within your family in a country, it's incredibly hard for you. And basically, once you're in that space, property wealth stays within families and then is redistributed through families. And I feel like that's the truth. I'm like, I acknowledge that. That's how I am on the property ladder.
And that's how I'm not.
Yeah.
Well, it is. It's like that's how me and my sister haven't had any help, but also it's a common conversation now of, that we are having with our parents of, I mean, my mum's view is that she needs to spend all of her money before she dies. But if there's anything left is do they pass that wealth on, sooner rather than later? And for those who don't have that luxury, what are the options?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's really hard. I think, I mean, I am all for the societal shift of thinking more about property as a place to live rather than, a wealth plan. I feel like I'm literally in the less than 1% of people in New Zealand that think that way. And I hear some people might be like, oh, New Zealand's different. These are Australian numbers. What are you guys talking about? But, the house price to income ratio in New Zealand is also tracked and published, and it is higher than the percentages that we quoted, or the ratio rather, than in Australia's. So, unsurprisingly, it peaked super high in kind of the start of 2022 and then has petered back down since then. But it's still much higher than even like the pre-COVID levels. And it means that it's no more achievable here from a price to income ratio, basically, than it is in Australia. And I think that this is fueled by the fact that people here have the desire to really grow their wealth and property. The tax situation encourages that. Perhaps less openness in education has been around like other ways to grow your wealth in the past. People are less comfortable with like the share markets and KiwiSaver and other ways to build their wealth. Property feels the easiest of all the options, even though it's weirdly not.
Well, I guess there's the historical, there's more knowledge, I guess, around it because people have relied on it. Yeah, exactly. So what do you think it's going to take? To change the societal understanding or perception? Because I definitely don't think that's the case in Denmark and, the Scandinavian countries and how they view their home, even I'd say in Holland and things like that. I mean, that's $1 million question.
It's such a hard question. Yeah. I don't want to get too political, but I feel like things that won't help it are some of the current proposals that the coalition government has put in place to basically revert or change back some of the laws to make investment property as a category more favourable. Because, again, I do stand by the fact that that is for a small segment of society. That's not for, the the overall society benefiting from property. So that's kind of challenging because, if policymakers and whoever's in government are also not approaching this from a point of view of property being there for security and comfort and safety and less about making money, then it's really hard to expect individuals to approach that in a different way. I mean, it's so tricky. One thing I would like to hope is that people feel more comfortable and knowledgeable with overall investments, and I would say shout out to all the platforms and the likes of Sharesies and Kernel and everyone else that does a lot of education around that, a lot more focus on KiwiSaver. The thing with property as well that's a weird niche is even if you haven't been a property owner, you've lived in a house. So you know what it is. You don't get that experience. You can't rent shares to understand what the share market looks and feels like from an investment point of view. Whereas you've had experience of I know what a property kind of feels like and what some of the upkeep is, and I understand how it works. And it's really, people think they understand how it works. They think that it's really easy and risk-free, and not necessarily, we know it isn't. But it does have an element of feeling much more safe. The way that you practice with using shares or investments and funds and things is by losing money, basically. And that's not a favourable experience either. No. Really. That could then scar you for life in the other direction. Exactly. And then you'll just rely on property forever. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But I mean, interesting because I originally came across this article from a friend that lives in Australia that shared this with me, and her view was she feels that the only way that younger people are going to have favourable living outcomes and investing outcomes from a property point of view is to get creative and look at varying solutions and, being open to things like co-ownership or ownership amongst family members or, renting for longer, doing those things that are well outside the norm. Because I feel as a society, we're still very much within the normal category, right? Whereas if I said to you, Christine, right now, what options are you thinking of? You'd probably say continue to rent or buy a house. Maybe we need more options. Yeah. Well, there's been informal chats with friends and family and things to do that, but I think there's still the fear around what that brings, and rather than no one's encouraging you from a financial ecosystem. It's if you went to the banks with an alternate solution, I think most people's assumption would be this is going to be hard to get across the line. They're not going to understand it. What's the tax? All those sorts of things are also holding people back. It's not there's anyone out there that's really encouraging people to think differently. And by not seeing anyone do it either, it's kind of you emulate what you see in a lot of ways, right? And so if everyone's relying on that and continuing to do the status quo, well, then that's what you tend to fall back on. Exactly. Yeah. This is just making me realise that we've got no solutions. Oh, I know. Oh no, this has taken a negative turn. I was we're sorry, people. We're asking some big questions but not really providing solutions. But I mean, look, to be fair, I think that it's one thing, I just feel that this is a different point of view that I was really pleased to see call out in a very public way by a well-respected journalist. I feel even within New Zealand, there's not enough people questioning some of the status quo around property. And we've had this before, right? Whether it be on the podcast or articles we've written, there's been one that we had published in Stuff that they had to turn off the freaking comment section because people were losing their mind that we dare suggest that you don't buy a home. And I'm that probably really sums up where we're at as an overall society and our appetite for thinking differently. But the reality is there's plenty of other great functioning societies out there where people do not rely on their home as their primary source of wealth. And so would it be so bad if we just came at other things? Came at that from an open point of view for the sake of our young people, because I can also equally see that my parents owned a home, their parents owned a home. I now own a home with my husband from the help of my parents. Lily will own a home because that wealth does continue down generations. Once you're in it, you can see that. But I can also step out of that point of view and be is this like, how do you get other people that are not from that position into what is a basic human right? And think less about creating policies and structures in society that incentivize, you know, some people to do very well out of that asset class and the vast majority of us to just either live or not.
Yeah. I think it comes back to policy, to bring back to your point around, you know, like almost everything that, and I'm probably going to create some hate, but that the new government has proposed is completely like reversing, you know, those basic human rights, such as even bringing back the no cause evictions and removing the rollover of fixed term tenancies into periodic tenancies. As a renter, that has really helped me have security and stability. But by removing,
but as a renter that also wants to invest your money in other places, like that's the thing, right? It's not like you're a renter that, I mean, there are renters out there that need to do that because they're trying to, I don't know, like shore up their financial situation, or maybe it's someone that's left an abusive relationship and is starting again, like whatever that may be. There are people out there that need certainty, but they're not even the people in your category that are like, you have some certainty and you have financial means. Like, you have the financial means that if you wanted to, you could buy a house. You just don't, right? And I'm all for that. But to your point, it's like, well, you should also be afforded the certainty to be able to make other choices.
Exactly. And not have to rely on that one asset class in order to grow my wealth. Exactly. Yes. Yeah, and the bright line. Oh, yeah, I could go on. It frustrates me so much.
So we're just going to skirt around the fact that we don't want to talk about the political drama debates. Other episodes coming in on that. But, oh my goodness, yes. Okay.
I do think it is, because I think about the, like, what is it that the idea of owning a home is? You know, it is fundamentally it's the security and the stability and these things. But, you know, I think one of the biggest reasons that my sister bought a house quite early was because that's what she wanted, and she wanted to make a space her own. But and like growing up, we didn't have a family home. We rented and we moved around. And like, I think that's probably a driving factor for me. But there's a different level of like certain, you know, like not desperation for that, but you know, maybe it's like not attaching to that need or to that outcome or something. Which might be the thing that changes the perception. You know, I don't know. I'm trying to think like what.
Well, I mean, think about it this way. If, to your point, we had policies in place that meant you could have the same level of security and certainty as a renter as you could as a homeowner, or very similar to, then that would meet some of that need. Because I think, to your point, like, people will have, beyond just the fact that they need a safe place to live, they will also have needs inherent to themselves. You know, some of it is like a sense of control, or other people it's just space, or, you know, whatever it may be, or being in a certain area, like not being in a city, being in a city, all of those types of things. And I think it's, how do we as a society deliver on giving people the option to fulfill those needs in a way that is somewhat equitable, because I think we can all reasonably acknowledge that right now there is an ingrained inequity in how it works. And I am thinking of some people that are probably going to slide into the DMs and be like, you know, I'm self-made, I made this happen. Like, sure, I acknowledge that. There are always outliers, but I also think we have to very openly acknowledge that there is a shit ton of inequity in the distribution of wealth amongst our population, based on who has had access to land, ownership,
funds.
Exactly.
Definitely.
Whereas we can also all agree that I hope, think that everyone that lives here and works here and contributes to New Zealand society has a right to be housed safely.
Yes. Yep, we can agree on that. Definitely.
And it's like, I just think that there's you know, there's a spectrum then, right? And it's like, what we're trying to say is, well, we're maybe too far down one end of the spectrum that then is creating too much of a gap for everyone else, or putting people in a place that further expands the difference between those at the upper end and those at the lower end, and those that are somewhere in the middle are just in this really wishy-washy no man's land that feels like they just have to jump on the train to continue going on because no alternate great option has really been presented.
Yep. No answers for you except
you're looking at me help me. is not where I expected us to end up today, but here we are. So this is a public call out if anyone has any great solutions. If you have a low-key in-it government and you just want to campaign here. But yeah, I think very interesting thing to talk on and think on. I guess for me, I'm all about at the moment, like just not necessarily following the status quo or like going against it, but just finding places where, you know, there is validity in questioning your logical thinking, right? And I think this is one of those thought-provoking pieces that it's like, okay, if this view were to be true, what would it look like if it was different? And if everyone in society was to view property as a way to just secure where they live and not a way to make money or grow their wealth, what would be different?
People will be happier. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, you know, like it would. What would it kind of look like to be different? And is that something that is actually achievable for you? Because as we've talked about before, there are lots of ways to still secure your financial well-being and financial security outside of just your home. And in fact, sometimes like being so fixated on a home is the thing that almost
stumbles you.
Yeah, exactly. As opposed to moving ahead with other things in a small way when you can.
Yeah. I feel like it's a really good opportunity. Maybe the thing that take out is to be open-minded, try to challenge the status quo, but also expand your knowledge of what is available, perhaps.
Yeah. Exactly. And be okay to be the fish swimming downstream, because I think the thing is that there's lots of fish that want to swim downstream, but not many people, to your point. Like there are not many examples that are championed. Maybe there are some people out there that are doing it, but we just don't hear about them.
Yeah.
And so shout out to anyone that wants to come to a money moments about did you never buy a home? Are you a secret millionaire? Tell us how.
Exactly.
But like actually
I'm going to hazard a guess they started a business instead.
They did some other things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, to your point, just food for thought, things to think about. There's always opportunities. There's not going to be one set way. Because we don't know how this is going to play out in the future, but I think the moral is we can obviously see that it's getting harder to grow wealth within a home. So what has worked for our grandparents and parents, or many people's grandparents and parents, is not necessarily going to work for us in the future.
Yes. And with that...
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah.
With that, I've got no good news.
And that's where we're going to wrap up.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to this spicy but potentially depressing episode. If you would actually like to chat any further on this, more than happy to chat in the DMs on Instagram. And we will also share the full article, and I would strongly suggest you read the full article published on The Guardian, which is actually only a small excerpt of basically a full essay piece that Alan Kohler wrote on this. So they're really good reads because it is just an alternate viewpoint that had some long overdue airtime, in my humble opinion. And we appreciate you listening to this chat. We appreciate you supporting it. We still appreciate you if you come into the DMs and disagree. And on that, thanks for listening.
We will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.